It's time for Pure Performance.
Get your stopwatches ready. It's time for Pure Performance with Andy Grabner and Brian Wilson. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Pure Performance. My name is Brian Wilson. Bet you didn't know that. And as always, my guest is, can you guess, Andy Grabner. Hey, Andy, how are you doing today?
Good. Hi, Brian. Thanks for, great to be back on actually doing some recordings. I know the audience wouldn't really know that.
They have no idea. Yeah.
They have no idea. Yeah.
They're clueless.
They think we do it always on the 2-week schedule. But you've been traveling, right?
Yes, I went back to New Jersey, visited some friends and family, and got to go to the beach, or as we call it, the shore in New Jersey. Shore to please. Yeah. Also found out, here's a stupid little tidbit. So after, I don't know if you recall Hurricane Sandy, probably a lot of our listeners overseas never heard of it, but it was this huge hurricane that really did a lot of damage to the whole eastern coast of the United States. But after that, New Jersey was trying to rebuild along the coast, and they came up with this saying, Jersey strong. There's a lot of Guidos in New Jersey. Like, yeah, Jersey strong. We're going to come back strong and all, right? And turns out somebody opened a gym, like a workout gym called Jersey Strong as well. So now it's confusing because if someone has a Jersey Strong bumper sticker, you don't know if they're taking pride in rebuilding New Jersey or if they're like, yeah, I go to this gym and lift weights, bro, So that's my tidbit. That's what I learned on my trip to New Jersey. And you've been running around a lot too, haven't you, Andy?
I believe so, yeah. Well, not running, flying Europe. I did a tour through Poland, a couple of meetups, a couple of conferences. Also visited our lab up in Gdansk, which was great. It was the hottest weekend of the year with 36 degrees on the Baltic Sea, which is kind of warm, I would say. But fortunately, the water was at least, refreshing still. And but we're back now. And we have...
Sounds like there's been a lot of chaos.
It sounds like there's been a lot of chaos. Exactly. And actually, I think distance-wise, Gdansk in Poland, in the north of Poland, is probably not that far away from the hometown of our guest today. And with this, I actually want to toss it over to Adrian, and he should tell us how the summer is up there in Helsinki.
Welcome back, Adrian.
Hi guys. Hi, Andy. Hi, Brian. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me back. Well, the weather in Finland, since that was the first chaotic question, is indeed chaotic. Last year we had the hottest summer in maybe 50 years, and now we had one of the coldest summer in 50 years. It's pretty weird. Today is nice, actually.
So you did not get the extreme heat wave all the way up there, huh? That's interesting.
No, heat waves here are 25 degrees.
Okay. Well, yeah, I think we got 40 here in Austria and 35 up there in the north of Poland. Crazy stuff. Hey, Adrian.
I'm going to try a quick conversion here. Hold on. 95 F to Celsius.
Man, when are you finally...
Let's see. So it's about 30. It's going up to about 35 like all week here.
Yeah, wow.
It's hot.
It's hot, yeah.
Yeah, when am I going to finally get on to we're never going to do that. That's socialism.
Yeah, no. So, Adrian, coming to chaos. We talk about chaos. Brian mentioned it, I mentioned it. So today's topic, after having you on the first call, it was really cool to hear about, best practices of building, modern architectures. I really love this stuff. And I used it again, actually, on my trip to Poland. I did a presentation in Warsaw, and I gave you credit on the slides that I repurposed for retries, timeouts, back off, jitter. This was really well received.
Awesome. So it's great to hear.
Yeah, thanks again for that. It makes me. It's great when you get on stage and people think you're smart because you told them something new. But it's also great to admit that all the smartness comes from other people that are all sharing the same spirit of sharing. And sharing is caring. So thanks for that. Thanks for allowing me to share your content.
Yeah, I don't want to take the credit on that either, because I learned it from someone else, or books or articles. At the end of the day, it's all about sharing, as you said. And teach what we had problem with 6 months ago, right?
Yeah. Hey, so today's topic is chaos engineering, and I will definitely post a link to your Medium blog post. I think part 1 is out and part 2 is coming. But it's a really great introduction into chaos engineering. And to be quite honest with you, when I haven't used the word chaos engineering until recently. I always just said chaos monkeys or chaos testing. And I think because I was just so influenced by the first time I learned about introducing chaos, which was, I believe, Netflix. At least when I read about it, Netflix was the ones that came up with the chaos monkeys. Is this correct?
Yes, correct. Yeah. It's all part of the resiliency engineering in a way kind of field, right? So I think the term chaos monkeys was really made popular by Netflix, right? And their awesome technology blog that talked the story about how they developed those monkeys, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Hey, and so, I mean, again, everybody should read the blog post. It's amazing the background you give. But maybe in your words, when you're introducing somebody into chaos engineering, when you are, teaching at conferences or just, visiting customers and clients and enterprises, how do you explain chaos monkey or chaos engineering? Let's call it chaos engineering. How do you explain the benefit of chaos engineering and what it actually is and why people should do it?
That's a very good question. And I'll try to make it short because I think we could spend hours trying to explain just the discipline of chaos engineering. But in short, what I say, chaos engineering is a sort of scientific experiment where we try to identify or especially identify failures that we didn't think of, especially figuring out how to mitigate them. It's very good at taking the unknown out of the equation. I think traditionally we've used tests to try to test and make sure our code is resilient to known condition. Chaos engineering is kind of take a different approach. It's a discipline that really tries to take things that we might not have thought about out of the darkness and bringing it out so that we can learn how to mitigate those failures before they happen in production.
Mm-hmm. So and examples, I think in your blog post you also had like this. You have a graphic in there where you're talking about different levels or different layers of the architecture where you can basically introduce chaos, right? So infrastructure is obviously clear. What else?
Yeah, I mean, it's very similar to resiliency, right? I think chaos can be introduced at many different layers from the obvious infrastructure level, like removing, for example, an instance or a server and figuring out if the overall system is able to recover from it. From the network and data layer, so removing, let's say, a network connection or degrading the network connection, adding some latency on the network, dropping packets or making a black hole for a particular protocol. That's on the network and data level. On the application level, you can just simply add the exception, make the application throw some exceptions randomly inside the code and see how the outside world or the rest of the system is behaving around it. But you can also apply it at the people level. And I talk a little bit about it in the blog. The first experiment I always do is trying to identify the technical sound people in teams, or the kind of semi-gurus, as I like to call them, and take them out of the equation and send them home without their laptops and see how the company is behaving. Because very often you'll realize that information is not spread equally around team members. And, I call that the bus factor. If that very technical sound person is not at work or gets hit by a bus, how do we recover from failures?
Mm-hmm. I like that idea. I mean, and Brian, I know we always try to joke a little bit, but I think if Adrian would ever come to us, I think he would definitely not send the two of us home because there's more technical sound people in our organization.
Yeah. So it's not necessarily the technically sound people, it's it's very often the connector. It's the person that knows everyone inside the organization or in the company that can act very fast, or that has basically a lot of history inside the company and that kind of recalls or is able to recall every problem that happened and how they recovered from it. It's kind of a walking encyclopedia in a way.
Yeah. But Andy, I think you can attest for the fact that I was just on vacation for about a week and a half and the whole company fell apart, right? So I am really, really important to the organization. Before we dive into a lot of this, though, one thing I saw on your blog that I think is really, really, really important for people to understand before even entertaining the idea of chaos testing or chaos engineering is you can't just start with chaos engineering. You have to have like prerequisites in your environment. You talked about all your prerequisites to chaos, building a resilient system, resilient software, resilient network. So you really have to, and correct me if I'm wrong, but how I was reading it, before you start the chaos engineering part, you have to build in as much resiliency into all layers of your system as you can possibly think of first. Then you start seeing what did we miss, right? You don't just say, hey, we just stood up our application in our infrastructure. Now we're going to throw something at it because, of course, it's going to fail and it's going to be catastrophic. So you really want to start from a good place, right?
Exactly, and that's the whole point of chaos engineering. Right? It's really I would say an experiment, scientific experiment, where we test an hypothesis. Right? For example, we believe we've built a resilient system. Right? We spend a lot of time. We say, okay, our system is resilient to database failures. So let's make an hypothesis and say, what happened if my database goes down? And then you take the entire organization, the entire team, from the product owner to the designers to the software developers, and you ask them actually what they think is going to happen. Very often I ask them not to talk about it, but to write it on the paper, just to avoid the kind of mutual agreements, like that everyone comes with a consensus by talking about it. Right? So if you write it on the paper in private, you realize everyone in the team has often very different ideas of what should happen if a database goes down. And good thing to do at that moment is to stop and ask, how is that possible that we have different understanding of our specifications? So then you go back into pointing the specification. Very often people fail to read it carefully or improving it. But once you have everyone in the team having a real good understanding of what should happen when a database goes down, then you make an experiment and you actually want to verify that through that experiment and with all the measure you're doing around it, from making sure that the system goes back to the initial state. We call that the steady state of the application, and also that it does that in the appropriate time, right? In the time you thought about. And you have to verify all this.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot to unravel there. But even before that, right, even before you run that first experiment, are there, and Andy, I don't know if you've maybe seen any, or Adrian, are there some best practices? Like I know there's the concept of doing multi-zones. Let's say if we're talking about AWS, you can set up your application in multiple zones. So this way, if one zone has an issue, you still have your two, like, the rule of threes. Is there, way back, if we go way back in time, Steve Souders wrote the, best practices for web design, web performance. Is there, and I know you've written some articles and all, but is there a good checklist for someone starting out or an organization, before they start these experiments to say, here are some of the starting points that you should set up before you even entertain your next set of hypotheses, right? Because obviously if you don't do this basic set, you're going to have catastrophic failures. Is there something written out yet, or is it mostly just things we've been talking about and word of mouth and people's blogs?
Well, it's a very good question, actually. I'll take the note and make sure I can build a list. Actually, that's a very good idea. But I would say I think the 12-factor app kind of patterns and it's a very good place to start with. I did put some list around, and I talk about resilient architectures in different blogs. I think it's really software engineering basics, and it's a timeout retries, exception handling, these kind of things. Make sure that you have redundancy built in, that your system is self-healing, because at the end of the day you don't want humans to recover. You want actually the system to recover automatically. So that's something that is usually not well thought, or not at every level. I always say, so if you don't do infrastructure as code and automatic deployment, maybe don't do chaos, or actually don't do chaos, because you're going to have big problems. Your system should be automatically deployed and managed and self-healed in a way. And then, of course, on the operation level, you should have a full observability and complete monitoring of your system, right? If you have no visibility on what's happening in your application, there's no way you can conduct a sound experiment, or even think that or verify that experiment first has been successful or has negatively impacted the running system, right? So, measure as much as you can. And of course, you need to have an incident response team in a way, or a practice, so that, what you should do as soon as an alert comes in, and treat the tickets, and being able to have this full response, kind of incident response.
Yep.
Dialed in, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So, and I know Andy's going to want to dive into all this, the phases. So let's go on. You mentioned kind of an overview of the experiment, the observations, the hypothesis, and all that. So, Andy, I know you probably have 20,000 questions and things to talk about. So let's dive into that now.
I mean, again, before I actually dive into, because you just mentioned in the end, monitoring incident response, I think in your blog post, you also mentioned that when you are in one of your cases, you inflicted chaos, and you actually saw that the incident response or the alerting was also impacted by the chaos. For instance, not able to, let's say, send Slack messages or send emails or stuff like that. I think there's such a huge variety of chaos that, like, your hypothesis is that we need to test against.
Yeah, it's very common to build system that kind of host or power our own response system. And you see actually that, there's been really a recent outage and with Cloudflare, for example, and they were not able to use their internal tool easily, right? Simply because their tools were too secured, right? Kind of the people didn't use their maintenance tools and long enough, or like recently enough, so the system had just removed the credentials. And when you're in a panic situation, having systems like this that actually are impacted by your own behavior is hard. But DNS is another one. Very often, if DNS goes down, your own tools are not accessible because they use or might use DNS. So all these kind of things like this are usually very important to test as well while doing the experiment. Right? That's why you need to start from or simulate the real outage situation. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So now I got it before going into the phases, because I know you have in the blog post you have like 5 phases that you talk about. But one question that came up while you were earlier talking about application exceptions, because Brian and I, we kind of live and breathe applications because we've been with Dynatrace especially, we monitor applications and services, but obviously the full stack. But we are very, I think, knowledgeable on applications. And when you said earlier, chaos in applications, like you can, just throw exceptions that you would normally not throw and see how the application behaves. Do you then imply there are tools that would, for instance, use dynamic code injection to force exceptions? Is that the way it works? Or do you just, change configuration parameters of the application that it will result in exceptions?
Yeah, there are several types of tools. There are libraries that you can directly use to inject kind of failures, either in Python. Very often it's using a decorator function that you wrap around the function and that catches the function and then throws some exception. Actually, I'm building my chaos library toolkit for around that, using that concept in Python to inject failures in lambda functions in Python. It's being used as well for JavaScript, similar technique. There are also techniques to have a proxy as well. So you have proxies between two different systems, and then the proxy kind of trap or hijack the connection, kind of man in the middle in a way, and kind of alter the connection, can add latency, can throw some exception, can inject, like packet drops or things like this. So there's a lot of different techniques. There's also one very common technique that Gremlin is using using an agent base. So they have an agent running on an instance or a Docker container that can inject failure locally, or this kind of things. Yeah. So they can intercept process level type of things and just throw exceptions or make it burst or things like this.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So moving on to the phases, if you kind of look at your blog posts, we already talked about the steady state, right? Steady state, basically, I think for me, what it means, first of all, you have to have a system that is kind of stable and steady, because if you have a system that in itself is not predictable, I guess in enforcing chaos on it is probably then not making it easier to figure out, is this a situation now that is normal or caused by chaos? So I guess steady state really means a system that is stable and you know what that state is, right?
Yeah, and it's predictable, as you said, right?
Yeah.
I think a big mistake what people do is usually they use system attribute metrics type of CPU memory or things like this, right? And look at this as a way to measure the health and the sanity of an application. Actually, a steady state should have nothing to do with this, or at least not entirely, and should be a mix of operational metrics and customer experience. I write in the blog about the way Amazon does that is the number of orders, right? And you can easily imagine that the CPU on an instance has actually no impact on the number of orders at big scale. And similarly for Netflix, they use the number of time people press on the play button globally to define their steady state. They call that the pulse of Netflix, which I think is beautiful because it's a relation between the customer and the system, right? If you press several times, then of course it means the system is not responding the way it should, right? So it's experiencing some issues. And similarly, if you can't place an order on Amazon retail page, it means the system is not working as it's designed. So it's a very good kind of a steady state. But it's important to work on that. It's not easy actually to define it. And I see a lot of customers having a big trouble first defining the steady states or their steady states. You can have several of them.
But for me, I mean, the way you explain it to me, it's kind of like a business metric, right? Like orders, the pulse. I don't know if I would apply it to what we do at Dynatrace, the number of trial signups or the number of agents that send data to Dynatrace. I have a hard time believing, but I'm sure you're right, but I have a hard time believing that companies have a hard time defining that steady state metric, because if they don't know what their steady state metric is, they don't even know whether the business is doing all right or is currently impacted. And is that really the case?
I guess you'll be surprised. It's not that they don't know what the business is doing. That sometimes the business might be doing several things, and it's. I think usually the business metrics or things like this are used, let's say, by a higher level monitoring that might go back to the managers or the C-levels, versus what we want is actually that kind of metric to go down to the engineering team in a very distilled way and very easy, accessible easily.
And okay, now that makes a lot of sense. And I have another question though. So you said CPU is typically not a metric because it doesn't matter what CPU usage you have, as long as the system gets back to steady state. But do you still include these metrics? The reason why I'm asking is, what if you are having let's say a constant, like if you look at the orders, right? You have, let's say, 10,000 orders per second coming in, and you're using X of CPU in a steady state environment. Then you're bringing chaos into the system. The system recovers, goes back to the 10,000 orders, but all of a sudden you have, I don't know, twice as many CPUs. Shouldn't you still include at least some of the metrics across the stack to validate not only that that the system itself is back in a steady state, but the supporting infrastructure is at least kind of going back to normal? Or is this something you would just not do at all because this is not the focus point?
No, you're totally right. The steady state is kind of the one metric that is important, but you do need all the supporting metrics as well, right? It doesn't mean, when I say the steady state is the most important one, it doesn't mean you should not include the rest. Mm-hmm. On the contrary, right? It's actually, you should have as much metrics as you can. It doesn't mean you should try to overdo the things, right? But I think the most essential one, especially for the cloud, is if you say you have 10,000 orders and your infrastructure to support 10,000 orders is the one that you are currently using, you make a chaos experiment, and then that infrastructure or the need to support that 10,000 orders is kind of a double, then of course you should raise a big alarm, right? Mm-hmm. And make sure that this is looked at, of course. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Cool. All right. So steady state, first state or first phase of chaos engineering. What comes next?
So after the steady states, we make the hypothesis, right? Once we understand the system, then we need to make the hypothesis. And this is the what if or what when, because failure is going to happen, right? So what happens when the recommendation engine stops, for example, or what happens when the database fails, or things like this. So if you're first timer in chaos engineering, definitely start with a small hypothesis. Don't tackle the big problems right away. Build your confidence, build your skills, and then grow from there. But this is endless possibilities, right? So what I love to do is usually look at an architecture and kind of look at the critical systems first. So you look at your kind of the APIs and what are the critical system for each of the APIs, and then you tackle first the critical systems, right? And see if these are really as resilient as you expected, or if you can uncover some kind of failure mode that you didn't think of, and things like this. And then you can go into less critical dependencies. But usually, most important is to make sure that the critical components are tackled first.
Mm-hmm. And this is also the case with the hypothesis. If I just recount or repeat what you said earlier, this is also, was it you explained you do the exercise, you go into a room and you bring everybody in the room, and then you discuss the hypothesis and let everyone kind of write down what they believe is going to happen, right? That's
exactly.
Also, yeah.
And this is, for me, is one of the most important part of that exercise, because you want to uncover different understandings and making sure that why do people have different understanding from an hypothesis. Mm-hmm. And usually this will uncover some problems already, like a lack of specifications or a lack of communication, or simply people have forgotten what's supposed to be.
Yeah. And also, if you think about this, let's take the database as an example. If you say, what happens if the database is gone? And maybe one team says, well, my system that is relying on the database is just retrying it later. And then the other team that is responsible for the database maybe said, well, but that's not the intended way. We thought you just go back to a static version of the data, blah, blah, blah. I think that's, as you say, right, uncovering a lot of problems that actually have nothing to do with technology, but actually have to do with lack of communication or lack of understanding of the system. Yeah.
Yeah, and very often what I've noticed, the big difference is usually between the design team or UI teams and then the backend teams, right? Many times the UI team will have not thought about this, like what happened if your database go down. Well, for the technical team, it might be obvious to move into a read-only mode and say, okay, we move requests to the read replicas of the database, and and eventually after maybe a minute, we file over the new master. So for 1 minute, your application will be in a state of, hey, there's no database. So what do you do? And very often people in the UI world won't think about it because it's not a case that they were asked for. Right? Read-only mode is quite weird, actually, to think of.
Yeah. Hey, Andy, I was also thinking when reading through these steps and also sitting on the hypothesis and the steady state piece, how this sounds like this would be a wonderful place for performance testers, engineers, whatever, to transition into. But specifically with this hypothesis phase, I love the idea of making this not just for chaos, but for performance as well. Let's say there's a new release being built, right? Gather everybody together and say, all right, we're going to run certain load against this. What do you all think is going to happen? In a way to make them think, well, wait, what did I just code and what might happen? Like, again, like classic database issue where suddenly we added 4 more database queries to a statement. Well, hey, are you thinking about that? But just even if it's not for performance, this idea of getting everybody together to say, what do you think is going to happen if X, whether it be a chaos experiment, a performance, some sort of a load test or something else, to say, what do you think is going to happen? I think that sort of communication with people opens their mind to actually thinking about what they're doing and what impacts they might have. I think regardless if it's for chaos, I think it's just a great practice for organizations to put together.
Well,
exactly.
Yeah, and if you think of it, I mean, the executing load or putting a load on the system is a form of chaos, right?
Yes.
So very cool.
Anyway, just wanted I love this.
Yeah.
It's great. It's great.
Yeah. So hypothesis is done. Then I guess you run the experiment, right?
Correct. And this is first designing and running the experiment. And I think here the most important thing is blast radius, right? So you have to keep the customers in mind, right? So, and of course, initially, if it's your first time, you might not want to do that in production and really do this in test environment and make sure that you are able to control the blast radius during your experiments. And this is very important to think about. Is like, how many customers might be affected, what functionality is impaired, or if you are multi-site, which location are going to be impacted by this experiment. So this is very, very important to think about. And then it's about running it, right, and identifying also the metrics that you need to measure for that experiment. So as you mentioned earlier, you might want to make sure that you control the number of instances that you need for a particular steady state, and make sure that you return to that same number after the experiment. And this is definitely part of the overall metrics that you need to check for your application.
From a running perspective, I think you mentioned earlier you have your Python-based library that can run some experiments. Then did Netflix also release their Chaos Monkey libraries to the world?
Yeah. I mean, the Chaos Monkey was one of the first tool ever released that to do chaos engineering. Right? That's now part of a continuous integration tool called Spinnaker, together with the rest of what they call the Seaman army. And that's, there's a bunch of monkeys. There's the Chaos Monkey, which is the original one, which kills randomly instances. There's a Chaos Gorilla, which impair an entire availability zone in AWS. And then there's the big gorilla. The big Kong, some gorilla is Chaos Kong, which shut down an entire AWS region, and they practice that in production if you maybe once a month or something like this while people are watching Netflix, just to make sure that their initial design is still valid, right?
Yeah.
Well, I wonder what would happen if AWS shut down an entire region. Let's not find out.
You'd be surprised, actually. We do. We do chaos engineering as well. We started very early on, but we don't do chaos engineering on paying customers, but we do have different level of chaos engineering, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Prime Video does that in production, actually. And I'm writing a blog post about that, so it should be out maybe in a month or two, something like this.
Cool. Hey, and then I think you mentioned Gremlin earlier, right? Yeah. One of the agent-based companies. So that's also cool there. So do you have any insights into what they are particularly doing?
As I said, Gremlin is part of the agent-based kind of chaos tools. So they do a lot of cool things on per instance level. So they can, corrupt an instance by making a CPU run wild, so 100% CPU utilization, and see how your application reacts. They can take the memory out. They can add big file on the drive to make it run out of disk space. I mean, there's a lot of different things, state attacks as well, like make it terminate or restart or reboot, pause, all these kind of things. Mm-hmm. And the UI is beautiful to use, right? That's what is cool. There's another very good framework that I really like is Chaos Toolkit. And that's more on the API level. So it's kind of a framework, an open framework that you can build extension with. So there's an AWS extension that kind of wraps the AWS CLI, and then you can also do API queries to get the steady state, do some actions, probe the system, and things like this. And the whole template for the experiment is written in JSON, and then you can integrate that in your CI/CD pipeline as well. So and actually the Chaos Toolkit does integrate with Gremlin as well. So all the tools are really working together in a way, and I think helping people to make better chaos experiment.
Perfect. Cool. I think it's always interesting the reason I was asking, people that want to go into chaos engineering, they probably also want to figure out, so how do I inflict chaos? Are there tools out there, frameworks out there? Right. And that's why I want to ask the question.
Proxy level is a very beautiful tool called ToxiProxy, right? That has been released by Shopify. And that's like a proxy-based kind of a chaos tool, which you can put that proxy between your application and, for example, database or Redis or Memcache, and disturb, inject some what they call toxics, and inject some latency or do some error, dropping packets, let's say 40% of the time, and things like this. So it's very interesting. Yeah. And then, of course, you have the old school Linux tools, right? WRT or of course, the corrupting the IP tables as well, and things like this.
Or the very old-fashioned pull the plug.
Yeah. That's actually how let's say Jesse Robbins famously did that at Amazon on retail in the early 2000s. Right? He would walk around data center and pull plugs from servers, and even pull plug of entire data center. So.
Yeah. Cool.
One question about these tools then, because the next part of this is all verifying, right? And you mentioned some metrics, and these aren't host or machine type of metrics. These are human metrics, things like time to detect, time for notification. Do any of these tools that you mention have either the ability to either pick up on, like maybe time to notification, or allow for entry to, human entry to say, okay, we detected it at X time, basically track these reaction metrics that you talk about? Do you know if any of those tools have anything built in, or is that something you'd be running on, keeping track of on your own? And then let's talk about what those are as well.
Right. So if you look at the Chaos Toolkit, since it's API based, you can query kind of all your system if it supports that to kind of add in the Chaos Engineering experiment report. So every time you run an experiment, it will print a report that you can then analyze. As for the Gremlin, of course, it's more agent based, so there's no kind of a complete report like this. But I mean, neither Chaos Toolkit or Gremlin type of things have a full reporting that would satisfy, let's say, the most careful team. Like if you want to write a COE, you're gonna have to do a lot of human work in figuring out all these different things like time to detect, notification, escalation, public notification, self-healing, recovery until all clear and stable, right? So there's nothing yet that really covers everything. So it's there's definitely a space for a competitor if you want to build your own company, Brian.
Andy, I think there's an idea.
No, well, I actually just thought of, obviously on the Dynatrace side, we do the automated problem detection, and we have APIs where external tools can feed events to Dynatrace. So for instance, if you set up the hypothesis, you could tell Dynatrace about the hypothesis, meaning you can say, you can set thresholds on your either business metrics like order rate or conversion rates. And you can then also tell Dynatrace, Friday, 6:00, we're starting the chaos run. Mm-hmm. And in case Dynatrace detects a problem based on your metric going out of the norm, it would immediately then open up a problem and would collect all the evidence, including the event that you sent. So I think in a way we could actually measure a lot of these things, and by integrating it even with these chaos tools, we would even allow you to automatically set up your hypotheses and tell Dynatrace about when you started the test run, when this test run was ended, and then Dynatrace can tell you when was the problem detected, when were the notifications sent out, and when was the problem gone, when did the problem go away. Yeah. So I think we need to. It's a great idea. So
actually, the Chaos Toolkit supports extension currently for open tracing. So if it's something that is going to be used at Dynatrace, it's definitely something you should look at. It supports Prometheus probes and Monarch, CLI, Instana. There's a bunch of extensions. So I think you guys should definitely write an extension for Chaos Toolkit to actually send them what it's called the Chaos Toolkit report to Dynatrace to add visibility and to the whole thing. Definitely, it's a very good idea.
Yeah, cool. So learn and verify. What else is there to know? Learn, verify, and then I guess also optimize and learn and fix things, right?
Well, I think the big part of verifying is also the postmortem, right? I think we should always go through the postmortem part, and in my opinion, it's one of the interesting things because you're going to deep dive on the reasons of the failures, right? If they are failures. So if your chaos experiment is successful, then good for you, right? You should also write about this. But if it's unsuccessful and if you've created or resurfaced failures that you didn't think about, that's the postmortem. And then you have to deep dive really, really well on the topic and, figuring out what happened, the timeline of it, what was the impact, and why did the failure happen. And this is the moment where you kind of want to go to the root cause. I know root cause is something that is very, very difficult to get, because in a failure, it's never one reason. It's always a collection of small reasons that getting together to create this kind of big failure. But trying to find as many reasons and as possible at different layers, different levels. And then, of course, what we learned, right? And how do you prevent that from happening in the future, so that how you're going to fix it? Mm-hmm. And those are really hard to answer. They sound easy when I talk about it, but it's very, very difficult to answer carefully all that stuff.
In your blog post, you talk a lot about you. I think you start the blog post actually with comparing chaos engineering with firefighters, because I think Jesse Robbins, he was actually a firefighter, if I kind of remember this correctly, and he brought game day to Amazon, right?
Yes.
And looking at this, so firefighters, I think you said something like 600 hours of training, and in general, 80% of their time is always training. Is there, and this might be a strange thought now, but is there a training facility for chaos to learn actually chaos engineering? Is there a demo environment where you have let's say a reference architecture of let's say web shop running, and then you can play around with chaos engineering?
Andy, I think that's called having kids.
You're totally right. I mean, one of the very, very good point of chaos engineering, and even when not done in production, I mean, in any case, is the fact that you can actually practice recovering from failures, right? So you inject failure in your system, and then you let the team handle it the same way as it would be an outage, right? So you will, practice and develop what the firefighters want to develop, like the intuition for understanding errors and behaviors and failures in general. Like, if you see, for example, an Nginx kind of a CPU consumption curve or a concurrent connection, and already all of a sudden it becomes flat, you have to develop the intuition for what it might be. Definitely the first thing to look is the Linux, the security configuration on your instance. Max connection is probably low, all these kind of things. And you can't build that intuition if you've never debug the system or trying to recover from an outage, because those are extreme conditions. And I mean, it's exactly that, right? Is practice, build intuition, and then make those failures come out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very cool. Is there anything we missed in the phases? I think we are
fixing it.
Wow, yeah.
Who wants to do that? We don't.
Yeah, it's like, you've done all the fun right now, so you have to fix it. And this is, in my opinion, I'll say something very important here is, unfortunately, I see a lot of companies and doing chaos engineering and very brilliant COEs or corrections of error post-mortems, but then the management don't give them the time to actually fix the problem. So I've actually was with one of these company a few months ago, and 2 weeks after the chaos experiment, which surfaced some big issues in the infrastructure, they had this real outage in production and were down 16 hours, right? So they could have fixed it before, but they didn't stop the features, or they didn't prioritize that, and eventually then they pay a bigger price, right? So it's very important to just not do those case experiments, but actually to get the management buying and make sure that when you have something serious, stop everything else and just fix it. And that's super important.
But let me ask you, why fix it if you can just reboot the machine and make it work again?
Exactly. You've been using the JVM for some times, right?
Yeah.
It's like reboot Fridays. Is that what you have as well at Dynatrace?
Yeah. Imagine. So besides obviously fixing it, as Andy was going on, was there anything? Obviously we want to fix it. Beyond that, again, I can't recommend enough to read the blog by everybody. But is there anything that we didn't cover that you want to make sure?
Yeah, there's the side effects. I think chaos engineering is great at uncovering failures, but actually, I think the side effects on the companies are even more interesting, and they are mostly cultural. Like the fact that companies that start to do chaos engineering eventually move, when successful, I've seen non-successful, but most of them are successful, move to what I like to call this kind of non-blaming culture, and move away from pointing fingers to how do we fix that? And I think that's a beautiful place to be, right? For developers, for owners as well, and because it's a culture that accepts failure, embrace failures, and kind of want to fix things instead of blaming people. And that's also how we work at AWS and Amazon. And I really like that. Our COEs and postmortems are kind of blame-free, and that's one very, very important part of writing that postmortem. And I think it's great, because if you point someone that is making a mistake, eventually it will come back to you, right? And you will suffer a mistake and be blamed, and that's never a good place to be.
Yeah. I think another good side effect too is going back to the hypothesis phase, where people will start thinking probably about what they're going to do in terms of the hypothesis in mind. So before they actually implement something, they'll probably start thinking more about what its effect might be.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's you think more about the overall system versus just the part that you built, right? I think that's an important thing. And of course, we didn't mention, but very, very good side effect is sleep, right? You get more sleep because you fix outages before they happen in production. So you get a lot more sleep.
Awesome. Hey, Andy. Would you like to summon the summarator?
I would love if you summon the summarator.
Do it now.
All right.
You've rehearsed that one, right?
No, well, Adrian, thanks again for yet another great educational session on a topic. It's a topic, chaos engineering, that I think it's still kind of in its infancy stage when it comes to broader adoption and kind of everybody really understands what it is. I really like a quote that I think you took from Adrian Cockcroft, who said chaos engineering is an experiment to ensure that the impact of failures is mitigated.
Yeah,
which is also a great way of explaining it. I really encourage everyone out there, read Adrian's blog. The 5 phases for me are, I think the first 2 for me are amazing, because steady state means you first of all need to work on an architecture that is ready for chaos, and you need to know what the steady state actually is and have a system that is steady. But then I really like your kind of, I call it experiments now too, experiment with the people to figure out what they think should happen when a certain condition comes in, like working on your hypotheses, because you can fix and find a lot of problems already before you really run your chaos engineering experiments. So thanks for that insight. And I really hope that you will come back on another show, because I'm sure there's a lot of more things you can tell us. I'd
love to. Thanks a lot, Andy and Brian, for having me once more on the show. I really enjoyed it. Really nice.
It's an absolute pleasure. I would just like to add one thing as well for anybody who's in like the listening, who might be in the performance or load side of things. Andy and I have talked many times, especially early on in the podcast, about the idea of leveling up. I'm listening to this bit about chaos engineering, and all I keep thinking of, wow, that's what a great place to level up to, or not even level up to. Let's say you're like, I'm kind of done what I feel I can do in the load environment or that whole field. This is kind of, I feel, in a continuation of it. It really boils down to hypothesis, experiment, analysis, and obviously you have the fixing at the end, which is very much the same as doing your performance and load testing. So, and it's a brand new, chaos engineering is not very widespread yet. Obviously, the big players are doing it. So there's a lot of opportunity out there to get involved with that. So definitely, if I were still on the other side of the fence, not being a pre-sales engineer, I would probably start looking into this a bit more.
Yeah, and it's a lovely place. People are amazing. They love sharing. So I highly recommend everyone to get involved in the space.
Sounds like it's just a sidestep over to a new world of experimentation. Anyway, Adrian, thanks again. As Andy said,
thank you.
Welcome back anytime. Anytime you got something new, please come on. It's great stuff you have here. We will put up your information. We're going to put a link to this article, so everyone go check out Spreaker/Pure Performance or Dynatrace.com/Pure Performance. You can get the links to the article. If anybody has any questions, comments, you can tweet them at pure_DT, or you can send an old-fashioned email to pureperformance@dynatrace.com. Thank you all for listening. Adrian, thank you once again for being on. Andy.
Thank you so much, guys.
Ciao, ciao, Andy.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.